Hi guys, this time in this chapter we'll have a slightly different format. It is a patchwork of teeny reviews, teeny snapshots of different silent films, 7 of them actually. First of all, The Merry Widow, made in the United States in 1925, directed by famous director Erich von Stroheim. Then, The First, made in the United States in 1912. Mabel Normand is in the cast. Then His Wedding Night, made in the United States in 1917. Roscoe Fat Arbuckle is in the cast. Then A Muddy Romance, Mabel Normand is in the cast, made in the United States in 1913. Then a small review of the American serial The Perils of Pauline, made in 1914. Then Barney Oldfield's Race for a Life, made in the United States in 1913. Mabel Normand is in the cast. Then Bumping into Broadway, made in the United States in 1919. Harold Lloyd is in the cast. So I hope you like having this snapshot, this small introduction to these silent films. Enjoy, all the best. Director Erich von Stroheim has a larger-than-life reputation to this day, due to his multiple clashes with studios about budget and artistic freedom, and even his tense relationships with some actors. But this film, being one of his biggest successes, both financially and among audiences, proved that Stroheim could also excel in more mainstream films with well-established actors. An entertaining musical starring the heartthrob John Gilbert, at the height of his fame and delivering a fine, passionate performance, and Mae Murray, an actress with good comedy skills who got to have a good comedy timing for this film. This film had a careful production by MGM, one of most prestigious Hollywood studios of the era. The scenery is grandiose and the pace is quite relaxed, almost a fairy tale. The director takes time to introduce the characters. There is clever use of visuals and images, as Stroheim is almost literary when it comes to attention to details of the plot. John Gilbert plays Prince Danilo Petrovich, a womanizer. Mae Murray is Sally O'Hara, a dancer. Crown Prince Mirko and Baron Sadoja are attracted to her, as well as Danilo. Sally chooses Danilo and both fall in love with each other, and he wants to marry her. However, King Nikita forbade Danilo to marry Sally because she was a plebeian and a dancer. Therefore, Danilo ended up leaving Sally at the altar because he couldn't bear the pressure of his family. After such disappointment, Sally accepted to marry older Baron Sadoja, who conveniently passed away in the wedding night. Sally inherited Sadoja's estate as well as the title of Baroness. 1 year later, both Danilo and Sally meet in Paris. They both start dancing in the ballroom and talk about the past. The point is that Crown Prince Mirko was also in Paris, and it became clear to Sally that Mirko showed interest in her only because of her money, and she suspected that Danilo's affection for her wasn't sincere either. Danilo challenged Mirko for a duel, even though Sally begged him to give up the idea. It seemed Danilo had died in the duel, but he only got wounded. Meanwhile, King Nikita passed away, and Mirko inherited the throne, but he was assassinated right afterwards. The second in the succession line was Danilo, who became king and got the freedom to finally marry Sally, which he did without hesitation. This film is a rare surviving silent short made by Mabel Normand and Mack Sennett at Biograph Studios, which was released in 1912, only some months before Keaton Studios was founded by Sennett in California. Despite being at the height of her youth and vitality, Mabel's acting is more restrained here than it would be in her subsequent Keaton slapstick comedies, which is adequate to the slower pace of this film. Still, we can see here some trademarks of the future output of Keaton Studios, especially by portraying Mabel as an intelligent woman with some independence and strength of character, which is a contrast with Victorian women, damsels in distress, who were totally dependent of their male guardians. Mabel is a spendthrift, and her mother-in-law doesn't agree with her extravagance, while her husband tries to please both Mabel and his mother. It's clear that both women do not really get along, but they have to live very close, or perhaps even in the same house, and it causes conflicts on a daily basis. Mabel shows that she is not the type of wife who would tolerate a bossy mother-in-law without fighting back. Mabel is not satisfied with the interference of her mother-in-law and goes shopping anyway. Upon her return, Mabel clashes with her mother-in-law again. Meanwhile, her husband is running out of patience with all this conflict at home. On the following day, Mabel gets some money out of her husband's pocket without his knowledge. He realizes the money is missing but doesn't attribute it to Mabel and thinks he lost it somewhere else. He stands up to have breakfast only to see Mabel and his mother arguing again. Therefore, he says, "One must leave." Mabel sees some beautiful furs in a shopping window and finds them simply gorgeous. Then she had the idea of pawning her furs, but unfortunately her plan wouldn't have the result she expected, as the furs she wanted so much ended up going to her mother-in-law, and Mabel doesn't disguise how furious she really is. This cute little film shows two legends of cinema, Sennett and Mabel, in the beginning of their careers in films, and their unique comedic style that could already be observed. It's also interesting that biographies films by the duo tended to focus more in the lives of wealthier citizens. Even Mabel's clothing and hat were more elaborate than those that she usually wore in her subsequent characters of Keaton films. Such paradigm would be deeply changed at Keaton Studios, famous for showing the lives of working-class citizens. This film, together with Coney Island, released in that same year, can show to modern audiences how daily life was like back to the 1910s, which sort of items could be sold in a drugstore, for instance, including beverages, purchasing habits of people, etc. It has 2 stars. Keaton was in the beginning of his career at the time and had immediately shown his competence, but he wasn't yet a star on his own right. He hadn't yet consolidated his world-famous stone-faced character. However, it wouldn't take long until Keaton achieved prominence. Roscoe Fat Arbuckle was a megastar at the time, and his comedies were full of physical gags. In this film, Arbuckle worked as a clerk in a drugstore. Both he and Al St. John loved the same girl, Alice. Alice's father ended up giving her hand to Arbuckle. Al St. John got angry and planned the revenge. Meanwhile, Buster Keaton showed up to deliver a wedding dress to Alice and ended up dressing it to show her how it looked like. St. John and his accomplices ended up kidnapping Buster Keaton by mistake. There was a huge mess, but the expected happy end came. Although still playing the role of a grown-up baby, sometimes with silly facial expressions, we can see the evolution of acting of Roscoe Fat Arbuckle, compared with his films at Keaton Studios only some years before. His gestures were more self-contained, gags were more elaborate, and scenery was modern. Furthermore, there was a troupe of comedians who worked with him, and they formed a rather uniform and experienced team. Of course, that there was still lots of physical humor, especially when his real-life nephew, Al St. John, came to the scene. Nevertheless, it's actually an accomplishment considering the good physical abilities, not only of Arbuckle himself, who was reportedly even very flexible and an excellent dancer in real life,
but also of St. John and Buster Keaton. All those actors excelled in physical humor, and that's one of the things that made them so popular among audiences back then. Some stereotypes of slapstick comedies are present here, like rather unromantic arguments among couples, ethnically insensitive jokes, food being thrown, people being thrown as well, etc. However, situations themselves were a bit closer to really than typically slapstick comedies. In the end of the film, the actors could show their skills to physically demanding scenes even better. Unfortunately, Arbuckle's career would be virtually over 4 years later due to a huge scandal. Buster Keaton would enjoy lots of fame in the 1920s, and his output stands out to this day. Unfortunately, Keaton's career would fall into obscurity for some decades, as of the 1930s, but he lived long enough to regain his popularity and further recognition to his work. Also, John would find steady work in westerns for some decades and made a smooth transition to talkies. Even though he wasn't immensely popular, he got to reinvent himself and remained in films for a very long time. In the first few years of Keystone Studios, founded in 1912, many of their films were one-reelers with quite simple storylines. Other studios produced similar comedies, both in the United States and abroad. Short films were still the most common length of films, as feature-length films were still at the very beginning. Films like Cabiria, made in Italy in 1914, and The Birth of a Nation, produced in the United States in 1915, some of the films that would help to consolidate feature-length films as more popular were yet to be produced. In a landscape that looked remarkably rural, Fort Stelling, with his typically exaggerated gestures and mannerisms, was by a window, flirting with Mabel Normand, who was in another window. However, there was another man interested in Mabel, a persistent suitor, according to one of the intertitles, and he came to her house to visit her. Sterling didn't really seem pleased when he realized that there was a competitor for Mabel's affection. Sterling also came to visit Mabel, but the other suitor was still there, and both men clashed. Sterling tried to attack the other guy, but ended up hitting Mabel with dirt instead. At this point, both men fought, and Mabel tried to intervene, and therefore she fell out of the window. The three of them threw things at each other. A clergyman arrived at Mabel's house in the middle of the chaos. It seems to have come to marry Mabel and the other suitor. Then Mabel, the other suitor, and the clergyman live in a boat, while Sterling tries to shoot them as he saw the boat departing. The Keystone cops were called to try to set the mess. The cops tried shooting too and embarked on another boat, and one of the cops fell on the river, and a short time later they got stuck in the mud. Sterling attempted to stop the boat from leaving by throwing mud on the river. More cops came to the scene with hoses and even a cannon. The hoses were useful to take their colleagues out of the mud. Unfortunately, Mabel fell in the mud right afterwards, but immediately the clergyman and her other suitor helped her out of the mud, and the three of them were eventually taken out of the mud river. Meanwhile, Sterling was into trouble, as he was caught throwing dirt on the river. Such simple one-reelers were very popular in the era, and the working-class audience could really relate to situations being shown. Keystone films were a hit since the beginning, and its actors became successful comedians. As time passed, the studio produced feature-length films, the first one being Tilly's Punctured Romance in 1914, with Mabel Normand, Mary Dressler, and newcomer Charlie Chaplin in the cast. And Keystone Studios became famous for discovering young comedians who would undeniably leave their mark in cinema history. For instance, younger Roscoe, Fat Arbuckle, and Charlie Chaplin worked there in the 1910s. The studio was closed in 1933, already at the era of talkies. It was one of the first female series in Hollywood, although it was not the very first one. It's often mistaken as the very first serial because it was the first one to have had a huge popularity among audiences. Pauline was a rich heiress who is pushed to marriage, but prefers to wait a little more and live more adventures in life, while she gets ready to become an author. Her refusal is understandable, as having a husband would make her leading a life totally focused on family affairs rather than exploring the outside world. Furthermore, Pauline's guardian wants to make sure that she will end up dying before getting married, so he can keep the money to himself. He interferes with Pauline's adventures so that they are more dangerous than they were supposed to be. Although the psychological profile of characters is somehow shallow, including in some rather simple matters like, for instance, who were Pauline's parents? Which was her past? Was she a romantic lady or more modern-oriented? And so on. We can compare her with other 1910s characters, such as those made by Lillian Gish in Biography Studios, and we can see how independent and less Victorian Pauline was compared with her contemporaries. This approaches Pauline to characters played by actress Mabel Normand in Keaton Studios. All of them independent, bold, fierce, untamable women, ready for an adventure and strong in their own right. Broad gestures and exaggerated facial expressions are still noticeable in acting by different actors, and it's understandable, as the transition to a more natural acting style was still ongoing in American films in middle 1910s. However, a more natural style was starting to take root, and it wouldn't take a long time until the stage-based gestures and mannerisms was overcome. For example, films by D. W. Griffith and Mary Pickford were already popular when the serial was launched, and the subtle acting portrayed in them would soon become the norm in Hollywood. Although associated with the stereotype of damsel in distress, Pauline was less helpless than typical women of her era, and despite all problems, she did get to have adventure moments. The plot has plenty of adventure and exoticism, both of which were into fashion back to the 1910s. In this first chapter, we can even see Pauline in a balloon. In an era when traveling was difficult and time-consuming, audiences could experience different things, even though those things were often portrayed in a stereotyped way. It was originally filmed in 20 chapters, but the only surviving version is from a French print edited into 9 chapters, released in 1916. We can also observe that the villain had the German name, Körner, due to the animosity against Germany during World War I. There were also problems with the retranslation into English of intertitles which were previously translated into French in this 9-chapter version, which gives modern audiences the impression of involuntary humor due to typos and weird structure of sentences. Actress Pearl White made most of the stunts of this serial, and while filming it, she suffered a spine injury which would bother her for the rest of her days. White was athletic, and in real life she had physical skills that matched her role completely. As it was previously said, many chapters were cut off of this release, but the remaining ones give a good overall idea of how this serial was like. In an era when cartoons were not popular yet, it was real-life actors who had to make the dangerous stunts, so audiences would get their own thrill. Years later, it would become hard for actors to keep up with cartoon characters and the nearly infinite possibilities of what they could do to endanger their lives and remain alive anyway. But it wasn't yet a reality back to the 1910s. It must also be added that this series doesn't use the cliffhanger, but the episodes are self-contained instead. It was a popular hit and made Pearl White become a star. She remained in high demand for series until the end of the decade, and after this time, she worked in Europe until her retirement some years later.
This film was made by Keaton Studios in 1913. It stars Mack Sennett, who was the owner of the studio, Mabel Normand, and Ford Sterling. Mabel Normand was a really popular comedian back then. She was not only a beauty, who was supposed to be rescued by the main actor of the film, but she also made her own stunts, and she was a daredevil. In real life, she was even an airplane pilot, and she was an adventurer and very full of charisma and popular with audiences. Ford Sterling was also a very popular comedian back then. Although his career continued for many years, he lost the peak of his popularity because of his acting style, grounded on exaggerated gestures and artificial characterization with fake mustaches and everything, which soon lost favor with the audiences. However, he got to move on as a bit player until the talkie era. In 1913, he was still in the peak of his popularity, as well as Barney Oldfield, who in real life was a pioneer in car racing, very known throughout the United States. In this film, Mabel and Mack are in love. However, Ford Sterling was also her suitor and tried to make advances on Mabel. As she was a very virtuous woman, being in love with Mack Sennett, she refused his advances. Ford Sterling became angry and decided to take revenge. Therefore, he kidnapped Mabel and tied her to the train tracks, so she would be killed as soon as the train hit her. But Mack realized that Mabel was missing and asked for some help of Barney Oldfield, who was himself in this film. And they both tried to save Mabel by car. And there's a very interesting scene with a race between a car and a train. Both of them were symbols of technology back to the beginning of 20th century. In the 1910s, cars were still not very common anywhere on Earth. They existed, but most of the population didn't use them yet. And after a typical rescue scene of the Keaton Studios with chases, we can see the famous Keaton cops. However, we know that the Keaton cops weren't particularly competent. So when they tried to save Mabel, they were instantly killed by Ford Sterling. So who could save Mabel? Mabel was saved by her suitor Mack and by Barney Oldfield, who were there in the nick of time, right before the train hit her. They got to remove them from the tracks. And this film was produced in 1919. Back to this time, Harold Lloyd was already on his way to become one of the most popular silent comedians of Hollywood. He started his cinematic career back to mid-1910s, at first without much recognition, but his luck would change when he joined the Harold Studios, which belonged to his lifelong friend, and when he developed a spectacle character, which was the boy next door, always optimistic and striving for social success and recognition, and who always got what he wanted with a heart of gold and always a smile even under very bad conditions. And he was a very identifiable and easy to relate character, and he became very popular with audiences. Lloyd was also a pioneer in what we call romantic comedies, which cemented his stardom in 1920. And this is a romantic comedy. Lloyd and actress Bebe Daniels, with whom he had a relationship in real life before he married his long-life wife Mildred Davis, and they are both struggling to be successful in Broadway. He as a playwright and she as a chorus girl. Both live in a boarding house, but Bebe Daniels runs out of money to pay her rent. Lloyd helped her, but he ended up giving all his money to her. Therefore, he has to find a way to earn money for himself.
And after some separation, Lloyd tried to sell one of his plays in Broadway, but he was kicked out of the place. Bibi Daniels wasn't successful either, and she ended up being kind of forced to accept the advancements of a fellow Broadway player, and she ended up going out with him to a gambling house. And she bumped into Harold Lloyd there. What happens afterwards is that Lloyd started gambling and all of a sudden winning, lots of money. And after a series of misunderstandings and very clever physical gags, the couple ends up being together and with plenty of money to make ends meet, always with lots of optimism and helped by circumstances. And although both of them had to struggle, lots of injustice and lots of money deprivation, they both, Harold and Bibi Daniels, remained with a heart of gold and always hopeful, which was a behavior very, very in tune with 1920s audiences and financial situation in